Top of the middle of the day to you boys and girls. We're at the bench in the shop. We're going to do another little narrative session. Today for your viewing pleasure, we're going to compare and contrast a motor saw 461 to a motor saw 462c. I'm going to throw the disclaimers out right off the bat. I'm kind of a knucklehead, maybe even a little bit of a gearhead. If you're that type, you might find this interesting and enjoyable. If you're not that type, it'll probably be long and tedious, maybe even painful, but you've been warned in the beginning. The other part of the equation is I'm going to quote-unquote probably slammer my speech through this process. That would be slur and or stammer. Please check the description area for any qualifications or corrections. My contact information is also in the description area, so you can shoot me an email if you're interested in having something worked on possibly. But anyway, let's get down to the fun stuff, I guess. Now we can roll into that later. So if you look at them outwardly on the bench, when they're fully assembled, you definitely notice some differences. The 462 looks a lot longer and a lot narrower. It's actually exactly the same length from the tip of the dog to the aft section of the tank. So they're the same length. They're like 19.5 inches overall. Width-wise, they are a little bit different. The 462 comes in at about ½ inch more narrow across the breast. So if we look at the handlebars for this operation, we see they're relatively close to the same size. But if we look at the back, the support that mounts to the tank in the back, it's a little bit wider on the 461, which is consistent with my rudimentary tape measuring device. Word of caution, you don't want to bend these handlebars on any of your new saws. They're a pain in the rear end to get them off. You have to loosen up the dogs to get the screw out that holds the upper front spring mount, lower front spring mount technically. This fits up underneath the cases. Hopefully I'll remember to check that out a little bit further. We have this special little support that's inside. Now, I don't understand why they do things the way they do sometimes. This saw is spring mounted. This is actually part of the stop to keep it from moving too far because it's spring mounted. Just an interesting side note. If we look at the cylinder cover for a second on the 462, it's a one-piece design. The Husky switched over to that situation years and years ago. Stihl's kind of going that way. 3/4 twist screws hold the cylinder cover in place onto the cases. If we look at the 461, this design's been around since the early 80s that I know of, like the 038, 048. Those saws had these. They were out in like super late 70s, early 80s. That design's been around forever. It's tried and true, but now we're changing things. So obviously we redesigned the tank in the new saw because the whole situation's different. If we take a look at the recoil covers or the pull starter covers, you can see there's a little bit different shape going on there. They're both relatively thin. They're both relatively weightless. I would imagine they use the same pulley system. Spring looks to be mounted in the same place. They probably use a lot of the same parts just because they already have those parts being made, which makes sense. If we look at the clutch covers for a second, we'll look at, this is what I call the big kid version on the Stihls. This has been around for ever and ever. It's the best chip management situation as far as the clutch covers goes, as that I know of anyway, in like a production saw where you go out and use it every day. I wish some of the other companies would pirate this kind of a concept and idea. If we look at what's going on the 462, the first thing we notice, it has captive nuts. We notice it's chicken wimpy in size, which means small. Maybe we don't notice, but I was looking at it going, it looks suspiciously close to the same shape and size and design of what's going on the 362, which Husqvarna did that for years. So did Stihl. This fits on all kinds of saws starting in the 064 realm. So for years and years and years, they used the same exact one. It worked well. I like to keep it simple, stupid method. Not so with like, let's design it into submission, make it look super gnarly. It's a burly looking operation, but it's not going to flow good as far as chip management goes. If we get down underneath a little bit, we see that there's a cartridge style twist-on air cleaner in the 462. 362 runs this. The new saws are going to this design. We have this rubber lip right there that seals on this part of the flange. If we look at what's going on, we see that it has a plastic rod that's molded into this particular piece, whatever they call it. These get loose, suffer from vibration. You guys got to watch and make sure you're not passing particulates. One thing we're going to note, linkages, like I said, different system for actuating the on-off switch. The whole process is completely different, but minimal amount of airflow is going to be going in here. This is all your airflow has to go in through right here, and it has to make a 90-degree turn right after it does so. Interesting concept to me. If we look at the 461, we've looked at it for eons, carb box cover, cartridge style, but the same design. Shape-wise, this air cleaner's been around for eons, again, since in the 80s, about 84, something like that is when the 64 came out with conceptually this shape. If we look underneath, we see it has a plastic piece that's in here. This is going to keep your, probably called a baffle, keep the charge that comes back through from saturating your element on your air cleaner. One thing we're going to note though, your air comes in through the filter. It's quite a bit more surface area where the air can actually get in, but it has to make a couple corners to get in the flange. This distance here, overall, there's more available area for the air to actually get in, but it's got to make a heck of a change, kind of come in, roll around down through, and down into the carburetor. I just thought that was an interesting side note. We look at the carburetors, completely different operation going on here. This is an M-tronic system from the C notation, so it's a servo essentially in here that's metering the fuel based off the coil that's monitoring the double magnet system on the flywheel. Just interesting side note, the gas and pulse gas, completely different design, semi-adjustable because there's stops. One thing we're going to talk about real quick, the middle of the venturi has a little piece cast into it, separating the bottom from the top. Fresh air comes in through the air cleaner. It's basically split by the shutter. That's this part right here. The fuel gets mixed in on the bottom with the fresh air. The fresh raw air goes through the top. The circuit's separated from each other with that little piece that's cast in there. If we look at the intake manifolds or the boots, we see that they both have the rough little patches in there, although it's split because we're splitting the air and the fuel air mixture from one another going into the 462. This looks on the outside just like the 661. Just as a side note, if we look at the cylinders, we see there's a huge difference in the way they're designed. This only has the Stihl name on it. I'm assuming they're making this specifically for themselves. This has an Italian name. I still can't butcher that name very good for you, but Giordoni, made in Italy. I think the pistons come into America and they actually machine the pistons in America for these saws. At least that's what I've been led to believe. But completely different design. If we look at, like I said, here's the situation. Lots of air can get in there. Not a lot of air can get in there with fuel. So a lot more restricted flow-wise, but it's designed to cool well. The stratified charged engines seem to run a little bit hot. If we look in again inside the cylinder for the 461, we see big hole splitting or changing the direction in a pretty short period of time to completely wide. We've talked about how this has pretty good sized transfer ports in there, but they're shaped, they're not flat, they're shaped funny. They're trying to have a barrier in this particular design of exhaust, actually keep the charge in the cylinder a little bit. That's from the engineering department, I guess, talking to the tech people. We've looked at the exhaust. It's very wide, which is sweet. The combustion chamber is fairly good size. You can see the start of the transfer ports, and we looked at the exhaust port quite a bit. It's pretty good sized, actually. Now, if we look at the 462, we look and see that the intake port's very small for what we have going on here. Keep in mind, this saw comes in at 72.2 cc's, as far as I can tell, based on the fact that it's got a 52 millimeter bore, but it's got a super short rod. There's some published information that they're a 72 cc saw. That would mean it'd be like a 34 millimeter stroke, unless there's some weird stroke length, which usually it's a couple millimeter increments, or it'll be maybe like a 37, like which is in the 661 or the 390. Generally, it's 2 millimeter increments. Anyway, I digress. Pretty good sized transfer ports, so I'm actually kind of impressed at the size of them. They're also inverted, but they're using fresh air to stratify, or basically get a barrier of fresh air in at the start of the transfer ports, actually trying to stuff them back, the fresh air back in there a little bit, slow the process down of the charge coming up through. You can see that the transfer port start of the tract is really similar in shape to a 661, albeit a little bit smaller. If we look at the exhaust, we see it's pretty wide. It's actually fairly open, and it's got a pretty nice combustion chamber size-wise. Segue off for a second. We look at a cylinder off of a 362, and we see they're relatively close to the same. But of course, it's a big kid saw, but it's got the little kid design. If we look inside that, we will look at the pistons for a second. Again, 52 millimeters. It's about a millimeter, or about 40 thousandths less deck height on this would be the 462 piston. Overall height, it's about 1.5 millimeters shorter, but it depends on how you're looking at it. Completely different design going on. Windows, old style. This one has the relief cast in the back of the skirt. Completely different. Just this completely different design with the piston and the function. Well, part of the function anyway. Look at the air guide and muffler gasket. This is fiber in the 462, light aluminum, metal, cooling plate with the standard operating procedure metal gasket that's been on that saw forever and ever and ever. If we look at the mufflers themselves, stainless. It's a super light, actually. Big baffle in there. It's got a baffle, but it's a little bit different. You're going to get a little bit more restriction the way this one has to like come up and around, and then the hole is pretty small. This is actually pretty open, so the concept of the baffle, much better flow in this, but this hole is much smaller getting into the muffler. Small outlet coming out of the muffler itself. You can see it's actually quite a bit bigger in the 462 with the same kind of, this looks just like a mini version 661, the outlet for the exhaust, but it's super lightweight. If we take a look at the cases themselves real quick, and we've talked about the 461 quite a bit, you can see the little aluminum piece that's bolted into the cases right here. It's deflecting the flow from underneath the dome as the piston goes down, trying to stuff it out the front. This is where the transfer ports sit that started the loop on the cylinder, so you're trying to direct the flow underneath the dome of the piston out toward the front. So that's kind of an ingenious concept what they're doing right there. Poly limited coil, but not Amtronic. If we start looking at the 462, which is really sweet, one of the things probably the first thing I noticed. Bar plate's pretty much the same. It's got the same situation going on as the 362, so I thought that was interesting. If we look underneath, we see this big open gap. That's where all that rest of that for the handlebar system goes in there, and the bolts actually go in this way. It's probably a little bit stronger system to a degree, but it's more of a pain in the rear to deal with. Haven't taken the clutch drum off to see what's going on. Not that important at the moment. This piece here is part of the carb box. It's the front part of it. It bolts on right here. You have to take this apart to get the cylinder out. If we look real quick, completely new design going on with the flywheel, double magnets. We have an air guide that's stuffing air into the carb box, similar to what the Husqvarna system does, the air injection system. But you can see we have a couple wires going into the coil, the Amtronic version. The main thing we're looking at, though, are the cases. If we check a look at what's going on, super small and compact. The crankcase is completely redesigned, obviously. The piece that's deflecting the flow from underneath the dome toward the front, where the transfer ports start, is actually cast into these cases. I thought that was an interesting, just interesting idea that they did. But you can see the volume in the cases is very small. The smaller the volume in the crankcase, the better your pumping ratio is. One of the reasons why this runs better in the stock form for being so small is because, well, there's a lot of things, but that's one of the reasons. You can see they even left the case gasket splitting the runs that come up through for the transfer ports. So we kind of did a brief little overview. We covered a lot of ground. Looks like I got quite a bit more time, actually, because I was rolling through super quick. Wanted to get most of it out there. One of the things I did do was I weighed, essentially, the pistons themselves. They're within about 1.5 grams, a little bit over 100 each. One thing I didn't mention that I will now, they did change the design for the wrist pin bearing. It's more like what you see in the 660 and 064s. I think the needle bearings come in at 80 thousandths in diameter. This particular wrist pin bearing's been around. It's the same, virtually the same one that's run in the Husqvarnas. They're coming in at about 58 thousandths the diameter of the needle bearing, so you can see it's a lot more heavy duty on the 462. One thing that I did notice, though, and you probably can't really even see it, but you can feel where the bearing has been actually running on the wrist pin itself, which I thought was interesting. Wrist pins are the same. They're the same weight, they're the same length, same diameter, 12. So I couldn't really tell. Obviously, they're just going to use the same one. That makes sense from a manufacturing point of view. It's about 3 grams more for the bearing in the 462. I actually prefer a little bit heavier duty bearing just because of what's happening. One thing I didn't mention, which I thought was interesting, this is the amount of nuts and bolts that it takes to deal with the unbolting of the 461, which is not bad at all. If you look at the 462, though, we have all kinds of stuff going on here, like we looked at linkages and apparati. A lot more monkey business to get that saw apart, which means it takes longer. I think I talked about the KISS method. I prefer that as well. I think I didn't mention one thing that they changed a little bit in the back of the pistol grip. I think you're probably going to get a little bit more support right here. Your hand's not going to be having a tendency to move around as much, I would imagine. So I guess that's about it from the peanut gallery over here. So anyway, we kind of covered a lot of ground. We looked at a lot of stuff. We did not look at the base gaskets yet. I do apologize. You can see there's quite a bit of difference in the way they're shaped. And if you look at the bolt hole pattern, it's quite a bit further the distance-wise, probably because we're redesigning the way the transfer port situation works. So we I think we covered the gambit. We talked about all kinds of new stuff. I didn't mention, though, that I weighed both of these saws. I filled them both up with gas and oil. Did a little test drive with them with a 32. They run about the same. The 461, I weighed them on a couple different scales. It was about 1.5 pounds, 1.7 pounds more. One of the things we have to consider on the 461 is it has a bigger clutch cover. This particular version has the aluminum skid plate on the bottom. We have full wrap handlebars on the 461, and we have more capacity for the fuel and the oil. So I'm going to have to put these back together, have them completely empty, and then weigh them again and check. In the initial run, the test drive, if you will, with these two saws, I found that they run relatively close to the same with a 32-inch bar that I mentioned previously on the first test drive. I'm going to say that the potential lies with the 461, definitely. You have a electronically controlled carburetor system, and of course they're both limited, of course. You have a 72.2 cc saw versus a 76.5 cc saw. This saw is in pretty conservative state out of the box. This saw is not. That's why this saw was able to hold its own in stock form against the 461. We looked at, if you look at just the port size for the intake, you're going to go, yeah, definitely potential lies in this camp over here. So my prediction is we're going to do SS Insano. No, we're SS Psycho. This saw is going to get the SS Psycho kit, which is like kind of just right down below what you do for a race saw. This saw I'm going to do as much as I can on it. We're going to test drive them again to see how they compare at that point. My initial indication from what I see and what I've checked out, I'm going with the 461. It's going to walk all over the 462. That's my prediction at this point. So I guess we're going to have to stay tuned for the ongoing updates on what we're finding and what we're noticing. But I think that's it. So thanks for watching this session. I hope you have a blessed day wherever you might be on God's green earth.